Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL, a BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Prologue: The distance between a handshake. Bryan Cortez had always believed that loving someone from afar was safer. There was comfort in the distant screens, stages, spotlights. No expectations, no chance of rejection, just admiration that stayed neatly tucked inside his chest, warm and quiet, like a song on repeat that only he could hear. Ethan Weiss had been that song for years. Bryan had watched every concert livestream, every late-night interview clipped and reposted by fans. He stayed up through ungodly hours just to catch Ethan's shaky acoustic sessions, where his voice dropped lower, softer, more human. Bryan had attended fan meetings, queued for hours with aching feet, bought albums he already owned just for photo cards. Ethan was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that filled a room even through a screen. His voice was smooth but powerful, capable of breaking hearts and stitching them back together in the same breath. And his eyes, hazel brown, warm and expressive, always seemed to linger just a second longer on the camera, as if he were looking directly at you. At least that's what Bryan always imagined. So when the email arrived, "Congratulations, you have been selected for a private meet and greet." Bryan stared at his phone for a full minute, afraid that blinking might make it disappear. The day of the event, he arrived at GY Entertainment's headquarters earlier than necessary, hands trembling as he clutched his phone. A small crowd of fans had already gathered near the entrance, their excitement buzzing through the cool morning air. Bryan scanned his QR code at the security desk. The guard nodded and waved him through. The receptionist directed him toward a conference hall on the third floor, her tone professional but kind. Inside, the room was modest. Rows of neatly placed chairs, a long table at the front, a few staff members standing by. Only a handful of fans had been invited, all sitting stiffly, excitement barely contained. Bryan chose a seat in the middle row, folding his hands in his lap to keep them from shaking. Breathe, he told himself. It's just a meet and greet. But it didn't feel just anything. When Ethan finally entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Applause filled the space, soft but reverent. Ethan smiled, bowing slightly, dressed simply in black. No stage makeup, no glittering lights, just him, real, close enough to touch. One by one, fans approached him. A handshake, a few words, a signed photo card, a limited edition chibi plushie, small, soft, with a tiny heart stitched on its chest. When pressed, it played a recorded line of Ethan's voice singing a short melody. Bryan watched each interaction carefully, trying not to overthink what he would say. Then it was his turn. He stood, legs feeling strangely light, and stepped forward. Up close, Ethan was even more unreal. Taller than Bryan expected. Warm. His smile was gentle, genuine. "Hi," Ethan said. The word alone nearly unraveled him. Hi," Bryan managed. His voice sounded smaller than usual, but Ethan didn't seem to mind. I really admire your work. Your music helped me through a lot. You're the best singer I've ever listened to." Ethan's eyes softened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That really means a lot. Thanks for supporting me all this time." He signed the photo card, then handed Bryan the plushie. Their hands brushed. It was brief, barely a second, but Bryan felt it like static, a sudden jolt that raced up his arm and settled deep in his chest. His breath caught. His fingers tingled. "Get it together," he scolded himself. He smiled, bowed slightly, and stepped aside to make room for the next fan. His heart pounded so loudly that he barely registered the applause or the polite murmurs around him. By the time the event ended, Bryan felt dazed. He excused himself and headed toward the restroom, needing cold water, needing space to calm down. As he walked through the quiet hallway, voices drifted from the lobby ahead. Ethan's voice. Bryan slowed instinctively. "I don't understand," Ethan said, frustration edging his tone. "Did I do something wrong? Is there a problem between us?" Another voice replied, lower, tired. "You don't see it, do you?" There was a short, humorless laugh. "You never have time. Not for me. Not for us. the man continued. I feel invisible half the time. Bryan's chest tightened. He knew he shouldn't be listening, but his feet wouldn't move. I think we should break up, the man said quietly. We want different things anyway. Silence followed. Heavy. Crushing. I just hope, the man added, voice softer now, almost resigned, that your next relationship doesn't end because you're always too busy to be there. Footsteps echoed. Someone walked away. Ethan remained. Bryan peeked around the corner just enough to see him standing alone in the corridor, shoulders tense. Ethan let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples with both hands, the exhaustion unmistakable. Bryan's mind raced. He was dating a man. The realization hit harder than the handshake ever had. Heat crept up Bryan's neck. Not disgust, not shock, but something far more dangerous. Hope. I shouldn't be here, he thought, panic setting in. I heard something I wasn't supposed to. He turned to leave as quietly as possible. Hey! Bryan froze. Ethan looked up, eyes widening in surprise when he recognized him. Oh, Ethan said, forcing a tight smile. You're from the meet and greet. Bryan swallowed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's fine, Ethan interrupted gently, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Really? An awkward silence stretched between them. Bryan wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. He bowed slightly and hurried away, heart racing. As he walked down the hallway, one thought echoed louder than the rest. Ethan Weiss is into men. And somehow, unknowingly, Bryan had stepped past the line between fan and secret keeper. Chapter 1: The Quiet After the Applause. The applause ended long before the feeling did. Bryan noticed it only later, when the excitement finally drained from his body and left behind a strange, hollow quiet. It crept in while he sat alone on his bed, shoes kicked off, jacket tossed over a chair, the small paper bag from GY Entertainment resting at his feet like proof that the day had really happened. He reached inside and pulled out the plushie. Ethan Weiss, reduced to soft fabric and careful stitching. The same hazel eyes, the same gentle smile. Bryan turned it over in his hands, thumb hovering over the small heart sewn into its chest. He pressed it. Ethan's recorded voice filled the room, warm, smooth, singing a short melody without words. It was intimate in a way Bryan had never noticed before. Not polished, not powerful, just close. Bryan swallowed. It sounded different now. Earlier that day, the sound of cheers and laughter had filled the conference hall. Cameras flashed. People smiled. Ethan smiled too, bright and practiced and perfect. Bryan had thought that was the real thing. Now, lying in the quiet of his room, he wasn't so sure. His mind replayed the moment again, the brief touch of their hands during the handshake. How warmth had spread up his arm like static. How his breath had caught as if his body had reacted before his thoughts could catch up. It was nothing, he told himself. But his heart didn't listen. And then, inevitably, his thoughts drifted to the hallway. Ethan's voice, tight, tired, nothing like the one he used on stage. Did I do something wrong? The other man's laugh had been small and dry, filled with exhaustion. You never have time. Bryan squeezed his eyes shut. He hadn't meant to overhear, hadn't meant to learn something so private, so fragile. And yet the knowledge clung to him now, heavy and inescapable. Ethan Weiss had a life no one applauded. That night, Bryan put on Ethan's music like he always did. Only this time, he listened instead of escaping. The songs were the same. The lyrics hadn't changed, but the meaning had. When Ethan sang about distance, Bryan pictured empty hallways instead of stadiums. When he sang about longing, Bryan heard it not as romance but as absence. Missed calls, postponed dinners, conversations cut short by schedules and obligations. The voice that once felt like comfort now carried quiet sorrow beneath the melody. How long have you been hurting like this? Bryan wondered. The next day, life resumed its normal pace. Classes, crowded sidewalks, half-listened conversations. Bryan went through the motions, but his mind lingered elsewhere. He found himself paying closer attention to his phone, opening social media not for updates but for Ethan. A new interview clip surfaced that afternoon. Ethan sat under bright studio lights, answering questions with ease. He laughed at the right moments. He smiled when prompted. But Bryan noticed what he hadn't before. The way Ethan's shoulders stayed tense. The way his eyes dulled for a fraction of a second when asked about inspiration. The careful way he redirected personal questions, his answers smooth but distant. You look tired, Bryan thought. Not physically, emotionally. For years, Bryan had admired Ethan from a distance, believing he understood him through lyrics and performances. He had felt close without ever crossing the line. Now that illusion cracked. He knew too much, and yet he knew nothing at all. Was Ethan the smiling singer under the lights, or the man standing alone in a hallway, rubbing his temples and trying not to fall apart? Bryan felt caught between two versions of the same person, unsure which one was real, or if both were. That night, as the city quieted outside his window, Bryan lay awake staring at the ceiling. The plushie sat on his desk, silent now, its song already memorized. He thought about how easily admiration could turn into something heavier. How knowing someone, even just a little, changed everything. He had wanted to meet his favorite singer. He hadn't expected to see the man behind the voice. And as sleep finally pulled him under, one thought lingered, unresolved and aching. Do I actually know Ethan Weiss? Or was I never meant to at all? Chapter 2: Unlikely Contact. Bryan didn't expect anything to come after the meet and greet. That was how these things worked, he thought. You met someone you admired, shared a moment, and then returned to your life with nothing but memories and merchandise to show for it. The distance reasserted itself. The world went back to normal. So when his phone buzzed late in the afternoon, Bryan nearly ignored it. He was halfway through rereading his notes for class when the screen lit up beside him. An unfamiliar email notification blinked into view. The subject line was short, unassuming. Thank you. Bryan frowned. He tapped it open. The sender name made his heart lurch. Ethan Weiss. For a full 10 seconds, Bryan did nothing. He stared at the screen, convinced that if he blinked, the name would change into something ordinary. A scam. A fan club newsletter. Anything but this. Didn't. His fingers went cold. The email was simple. Hi Bryan. I hope this message isn't intrusive. GY Entertainment shared your contact details from the consent form you signed at the event yesterday. I wanted to thank you properly for what you said during the meet and greet. Your words stayed with me longer than you might think. Ethan. That was all. No signature. No emojis. Just his name. Bryan leaned back in his chair, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the noise of the room around him. People walked past. Someone laughed nearby. The world continued on, oblivious to the fact that Ethan Weiss had just stepped into his inbox. This can't be real, he thought. He checked the sender address. Official domain. Verified. It was real. A rush of emotions followed. Excitement first, sharp and breathless. Then fear. Then guilt, curling deep in his stomach. Why is he emailing me? Bryan's thoughts jumped immediately to the hallway. To the words he wasn't meant to hear. To the moment Ethan had seen him standing there, exposed. Does he know that I know? Or worse, does he think I'm the kind of fan who listens in? He hovered over the reply button, thumb trembling. What could he possibly say that wouldn't cross a line? For years, Bryan had admired Ethan from afar, careful never to mistake appreciation for entitlement. He'd never commented anything invasive, never expected attention, never wanted to be seen. And now here it was, being noticed. He typed a response. Hi Ethan. Thank you so much for your message. He deleted it. Too eager. He typed again. Hello. I'm honored you took the time to email me. Deleted. He exhaled slowly and set the phone down, pressing his palms against his thighs as if grounding himself. His heart felt too big for his chest, filled with things he didn't know how to name yet. If I reply, he thought, this becomes real. After several long minutes, he picked up the phone again. This time, he typed carefully. Hi Ethan, thank you for reaching out. I didn't expect this, but I really appreciate it. I meant what I said yesterday. Your music has meant a lot to me. Bryan. He stared at the message one last time, then hit send. The moment the email left his phone, regret hit him, sharp and immediate. What if that was too much? What if it wasn't enough? He set the phone face down on the desk and tried to focus on anything else. He lasted 3 minutes. When he checked again, there was already a reply. I'm glad. I wanted to make sure you knew that your words came at a good time. Bryan swallowed. A good time. The phrase carried weight he didn't know how to respond to. Another message followed. And this might be awkward to ask. About yesterday after the event. In the hallway, Bryan's pulse spiked. There it was. He stared at the screen, his chest tightening as he replayed the memory again. The tension in Ethan's voice, the quiet resignation of the other man, the way Ethan had looked so alone. Be honest, Bryan told himself. But be careful. I'm really sorry about that. I didn't mean to overhear anything. I was on my way to the restroom and didn't realize. I left as soon as I could. The reply took longer this time. Bryan found himself holding his breath, counting the seconds. Then, thank you for telling me. I just wanted to be sure. I hope that didn't make you uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. Bryan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I was surprised, but not uncomfortable. I hope you're okay. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. I will be. I think I just needed someone to say that. The conversation stalled there, settling into a gentle pause. Not awkward, not quite complete. Bryan stared at the last message, heart thrumming with something new and fragile. They hadn't talked about anything deeply personal. They hadn't crossed any obvious lines. And yet, this wasn't nothing. Ethan Weiss had chosen to reach out, had trusted Bryan just a little with something unsaid but understood. As Bryan set his phone down, he felt the thread between them stretch into place. Thin, delicate, almost invisible, a connection that could snap at the slightest pull. And yet, against his better judgment, Bryan found himself hoping it wouldn't. Chapter 3: The Space Between Words. Their conversations didn't become constant. They didn't turn into late-night calls or endless message threads that blurred into dawn. Instead, what formed between Bryan and Ethan was something quieter. Messages sent hours apart, sometimes a full day passing between replies. Deliberate, careful, as if both of them were testing the strength of the space between words. Bryan found himself thinking about Ethan more often than he wanted to admit. Not in the breathless, starstruck way he used to, but differently. More grounded, more aware. When his phone buzzed now, it wasn't the rush of excitement that followed, but a slow, steady warmth. A greeting, a question, a thought shared without expectation. How was your day? Ethan had sent that one evening, long after Bryan assumed the day had already claimed him. Bryan stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Busy but manageable. How about you? The answer came nearly an hour later. Long, but quiet now. Bryan imagined him somewhere alone. Maybe a studio, maybe a hotel room, lights dimmed low, the noise of the world finally turned down. He didn't ask for details. Instead, he replied, I'm glad you have a quiet moment. Ethan reacted to the message with a simple heart. It shouldn't have meant anything. It did. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Conversations threaded through their lives without interrupting them. Ethan would message between rehearsals or flights. Bryan would reply between classes or during breaks at work. They talked about small things. Music Bryan liked that wasn't Ethan's. Books Ethan read to fall asleep. How both of them preferred late nights to early mornings. How silence could be comforting if shared properly. What they didn't talk about was just as noticeable. Ethan never mentioned his breakup. Never named the person who had walked away in that hallway. If Bryan came close, asking about stress, about exhaustion, Ethan would answer carefully, choosing words that revealed without exposing. It's been a strange adjustment, he wrote once. Getting used to being by myself again. Bryan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Again. He wanted to ask more. Wanted to say he understood, even if he didn't fully. But a quiet alarm rang in his chest, a reminder of where the line was. So he wrote, change takes time. You don't have to rush it. Ethan replied with a simple, thank you. That became another pattern. Bryan offered space without disappearing. Care without expectation. He didn't gush or praise. He didn't treat Ethan like something untouchable. And Ethan noticed. "You're easy to talk to," Ethan wrote one night. "I don't feel like I have to perform." Bryan read that message twice. The word perform lingered. "I'm glad," Bryan replied. "I wouldn't want you to feel like you have to be anything else." The response came almost immediately. "That's rare for me." Bryan sat back in his chair, heart thudding. He was learning things about Ethan Weiss that no interview could ever reveal. That fame had crowded him, boxed him in. That being seen constantly didn't mean being known. Loneliness, Bryan realized, wasn't about being alone. It was about not being understood. And Ethan, for all his success and attention, carried that loneliness quietly. Bryan, on the other hand, carried a different struggle. He was constantly aware of the imbalance between them. One wrong step, one overly personal question, and he would become exactly what he never wanted to be, a fan who took more than he was given. Sometimes he caught himself typing things and stopping halfway through. "I thought of you when I heard this song." Delete. "Are you eating properly?" Delete. "I miss talking to you." Delete. Instead, he kept his words simple. Present. Real. He reminded himself that this connection, whatever it was, had to exist without pressure. Ethan never asked him to be more, and Bryan refused to assume he was allowed to. There were nights when the silence stretched longer than usual, when Bryan would check his phone, see no new messages, and feel the familiar ache of wanting without claiming. He learned to sit with it, because when Ethan did reach out again, it always felt intentional. "Are you awake? Can I tell you something small? I had a good rehearsal today." Small things, but they mattered. One evening, after a particularly long pause between messages, Ethan sent, "Thank you for not asking things I'm not ready to answer." Bryan's chest tightened. "Thank you for trusting me anyway." The typing indicator blinked, then stopped, then blinked again. "I think that's why this feels safe." Safe. The word settled between them, soft but heavy with meaning. Bryan set his phone down and stared at the ceiling, a quiet smile pulling at his lips. Silence didn't always mean absence. Sometimes it meant respect. Sometimes it meant care. And in the space between their words, something fragile continued to grow. Not loudly, not recklessly, but patiently. Waiting. Chapter 4. When the world is loud. The quiet they had found didn't last. It never did. Bryan noticed the shift before Ethan ever mentioned it. Replies that once came gently, thoughtfully, now arrived hours later, sometimes not at all. When they did, they were shorter, carefully shaped around exhaustion. "Sorry. Long day. Rehearsals ran late. Early call time tomorrow." Bryan read each message without complaint, without question. He understood, at least in theory. Ethan Weiss didn't belong to quiet days. His life was a constant motion of schedules and demands, shaped by people who needed him everywhere at once. Still, the distance crept in. One night, as Bryan scrolled through social media, he saw it in full display. Tour announcements, studio photos, interview clips stacked one after another. Ethan smiling beneath bright lights, dressed impeccably, praised endlessly. Everyone wants a piece of you, Bryan thought. He wondered how much was left when the cameras turned off. It was almost midnight when Ethan finally messaged. "Are you up?" Bryan hesitated before replying. "Yeah, I am." Several minutes passed. "I don't usually say this," Ethan wrote, "but I'm tired in a way sleep doesn't fix." Bryan leaned back against his headboard, phone warm in his hand. "That sounds heavy." "It is. Everything feels loud lately." Bryan pictured the noise. Crowds, music, voices calling Ethan's name. Expectations layered thick over every movement. "Do you ever feel like people see the version of you they want?" Ethan continued, "Not the one you actually are." Bryan didn't answer right away. He chose his words carefully. "I think most people do, especially when someone's in the spotlight." The reply came almost immediately. "It feels like disappearing in plain sight." The words hit harder than Bryan expected. Ethan went on, messages coming faster now, the restraint slipping. "I'm grateful. I really am. But sometimes I wish I could walk into a room and not be recognized. Just exist. Bryan read the message twice. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer advice or optimism. He knew better. That sounds lonely, he wrote instead. The typing indicator flickered. It is more than I thought it would be. There it was, the truth, raw and unguarded. Bryan stayed quiet, letting Ethan speak, letting the space hold what needed to be said. Everyone tells me how lucky I am, Ethan continued. And I am. But luck doesn't make it easier to breathe sometimes. Bryan closed his eyes. He had spent years believing that fame was a dream, a prize at the end of hard work. He had never thought about how isolating it could be. To be constantly watched, constantly needed, constantly misunderstood. I see you, Bryan wrote finally. Not the version people clap for. The pause that followed felt charged. That's why I like talking to you, Ethan replied. You don't look at me like I owe you something. Bryan's chest tightened. Because you don't, he wanted to say. Instead, he wrote, you don't owe me anything. The conversation ended not long after. Ethan sent a brief goodnight. Bryan wished him rest. But long after the screen went dark, Bryan sat staring at his phone, unease curling in his chest. The gap between their worlds had never felt wider. The next few days were worse. Ethan's schedule intensified. Tour rehearsals bled into recording sessions. Interviews stacked back to back. Bryan watched from the sidelines as Ethan appeared everywhere. Smiling, performing, thriving. Except now Bryan could see the cracks. The tired eyes. The careful answers. The way Ethan leaned into professionalism like armor. How can someone so visible be so alone? Bryan wondered. And then the other thought came, unwelcome and sharp. Where do I fit in that world? The answer, painfully, felt like nowhere. Bryan realized how small his presence truly was. A message in the quiet. A voice in the dark. Something easily lost amid the noise. One night, Bryan caught himself waiting. Waiting for a message. Waiting for reassurance. Waiting for something he had no right to ask for. The realization scared him. He didn't want to become another demand. Another weight. Another thing Ethan had to carry. So Bryan did the only thing he could think to do. He pulled back. Replies became shorter. He waited longer before responding. He stopped initiating conversations altogether. Not out of anger, out of fear. Fear that he was growing attached to something that couldn't last. Fear that knowing Ethan, really knowing him, would only lead to heartbreak. Ethan didn't say anything at first. And that, more than anything, told Bryan how easy it would be to disappear. The world was loud. And Bryan was very, very quiet. Too quiet to be heard. Too quiet to stay. Chapter 5, Crossing Lines. The invitation came quietly. Not announced. Not dramatic. Just a message that appeared on Bryan's phone late one evening, when the rain outside his window tapped softly against the glass. Are you free tomorrow night? Bryan stared at the screen longer than necessary. His first instinct was hesitation. His second was fear. He had been careful, too careful perhaps, about pulling back, about not wanting too much. And yet, the space he had created between them felt heavier than the risk of stepping closer. I am, he typed. Is everything okay? The reply came a minute later. I think so. I was wondering if you'd want to meet. Somewhere quiet. Bryan's heart thudded. Meet. Not a fan event. Not a public space filled with people who knew Ethan as an idol. Just the two of them. Okay, Bryan replied. I'd like that. They agreed on a small cafe tucked into a side street near the edge of the city. One that stayed open late, where the lights were dim and the crowd sparse. When Bryan arrived, rain still clung to the air, the pavement slick and shining beneath street lamps. Ethan was already there. He sat in the far corner, hood pulled low, baseball cap shadowing his face. He looked smaller somehow, less like the person Bryan saw everywhere, and more like the man he spoke to in messages. Hey, Ethan said softly when Bryan approached. Hey, Bryan replied, suddenly unsure where to put his hands, his gaze, his weight. They stood there for a second too long before Ethan gestured to the seat across from him. Bryan sat, heart racing, every sense tuned in. The awkwardness was immediate. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Words that flowed easily through screens felt heavier aloud, weighted with presence. The waitress came. Orders were placed. Silence settled between them, thick but not unfriendly. Outside, rain streaked down the windows. Ethan broke the silence first. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I know I kind of dropped this on you." Bryan shook his head. "It's fine. I wanted to." Ethan smiled faintly, something soft easing into his expression. "Good." As minutes passed, the tension loosened. They talked about the cafe, the weather, the strange comfort of late nights. Ethan laughed quietly at something Bryan said, his shoulders relaxing as if he'd been holding them tense all day. "This place feels normal," Ethan admitted. "I like that." Bryan nodded. "I come here when I want to disappear for a bit." Ethan glanced at him, eyes searching. "Yeah, I figured." The conversation slowed again. Not because they had nothing to say, but because something more important hovered beneath the surface. Eventually, Ethan exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "I asked you here because I owe you an apology," he said. Bryan stiffened. "You don't." "I do," Ethan insisted gently, "for how I sounded the last time we talked. I didn't mean to unload like that." Bryan shook his head. "You weren't unloading. You were just being honest." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "Can I be honest now?" he asked. Bryan's pulse quickened. "Yeah." Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands, fingers wrapped around his mug. "I ended things," he said quietly, "with my boyfriend, the day you overheard." Bryan's chest tightened. "I didn't plan for it to happen like that. We'd been drifting for a while. Different priorities. Different lives." Ethan's voice stayed steady, but there was a fragility beneath it. "I think I was holding on because it felt like I was supposed to." Bryan listened, his instinct to reach out restrained by years of self-control. "I'm sorry," Bryan said softly, "for hearing it. I should have." "I'm glad you did," Ethan interrupted. Bryan blinked. Ethan looked up, eyes clear, almost relieved. "I didn't realize how much I needed to say it out loud until someone else was there. Even unintentionally." Bryan swallowed. "I never told anyone. I wouldn't." "I know," Ethan said, and the certainty in his voice startled Bryan. "That's why I wanted to tell you properly." Silence stretched between them again. But this time it felt different. Heavier. Warmer. "I don't talk about this stuff," Ethan continued. "Not really. People either pity me or make it about the music." He gave a small, wry smile. "You just listen." Bryan met his gaze. "I don't know how to do anything else." The honesty hung in the air, delicate and dangerous. Outside, the rain slowed, the city quieting as the night deepened. Bryan realized then that something had shifted. They were no longer just exchanging careful words. They were sharing something fragile, trust, vulnerability, the kind of closeness that didn't come with rules. When they finally stood to leave, the space between them felt narrower than before. Not gone, but thinner. And as they stepped back into the night, Bryan knew, deep in his chest, that they had crossed a line neither of them knew how to redraw. Chapter 6, almost but not yet. After that night, everything felt closer. Not louder, not clearer, just nearer. As if the space between Bryan and Ethan had thinned to something fragile, translucent. Still there, but barely. They didn't talk about the cafe. They didn't talk about what had shifted. Instead, they moved forward carefully, as though acknowledging it outright might shatter whatever balance they'd found. Their messages resumed, softer now, threaded with an ease that hadn't existed before. The pauses between replies shortened. The silences didn't feel like distance anymore. They felt intentional. One evening, rain caught them both by surprise. Ethan had insisted on walking Bryan part of the way home, cap pulled low, mask tucked under his chin as they stepped into the damp night. Bryan had opened his umbrella, then hesitated. "It's not that big," Bryan said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Then I'll stay close." They walked like that, shoulder to shoulder beneath the umbrella, their steps naturally sinking. Bryan was acutely aware of every detail. the warmth radiating from Ethan's arm, the faint scent of soap and rain, the way their hands brushed when the wind nudged the umbrella off course. Neither of them moved away. At one point, Ethan laughed quietly at something Bryan said, and the sound settled warmly between them. This feels dangerous, Bryan thought, and yet he didn't want it to stop. Moments like that began to slip into their time together, small, unremarkable things that felt anything but. Sitting close during late-night studio visits, passing each other in narrow hallways, the brush of fingers when sharing coffee. Each moment hovered on the edge of something more. Each moment stopped just short. Bryan felt the shift inside himself most acutely during the quiet. When Ethan wasn't around, Bryan's thoughts circled restlessly. He caught himself wondering if Ethan was eating properly, if he'd slept enough, if he was alone. This isn't what being a fan feels like, Bryan realized one night. He wasn't watching from a distance anymore. He wasn't content with admiration. He wanted presence, consistency, to be chosen. The thought terrified him, because wanting meant risking. Ethan, too, seemed caught in something he couldn't name. There were moments when his gaze lingered too long, when his hand would hover as if he meant to reach out, only to stop at the last second. When he fell silent mid-sentence, eyes clouded with something that looked a lot like conflict. One night, as they sat on opposite ends of a couch in the studio, the room lit only by a desk lamp, Ethan spoke quietly. "This is complicated," he said. Bryan's breath caught. "Yeah." Ethan rubbed his palms together, restless. "I shouldn't want things that make life harder." Bryan knew what he meant, knew the weight of expectation, of headlines and consequences. "You're allowed to want things," Bryan said, though his voice trembled slightly. Ethan looked at him, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Even if they put someone else at risk?" The words landed between them like a warning. Bryan swallowed. "I can decide what I'm willing to risk." Silence followed, thick, charged. Ethan turned away first. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly, "or complicate your life. You already have," Bryan thought. But he didn't say it. Instead, he nodded. "I know." There were nights when the tension pressed so heavily between them that Bryan felt breathless. When a look or a laugh almost turned into a confession. When a touch lingered just long enough to make his heart race. But neither of them crossed that final line. They danced around it instead, careful, aching, restrained. Neither of them said the word love. They didn't need to. It existed in the unsaid, in the moments that almost happened, in the space that grew tighter every day. By the time Bryan lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling with Ethan's laughter still echoing in his ears, he understood something with painful clarity. Almost was worse than nothing. And if something didn't change soon, the wanting would become unbearable. Chapter 7: Distance as a Choice. Bryan decided to pull away on an ordinary Tuesday. There was no argument, no dramatic turning point, just a quiet moment of clarity while he stood at a crosswalk, phone in hand, rereading a message he hadn't answered yet. "Are you free later?" Should have made him smile. Instead, his chest tightened, because he knew what came after. The almost, the lingering looks, the way his heart kept reaching for something that had no name and no promise. So Bryan did the one thing he had been carefully avoiding. He waited. He didn't reply right away. He told himself he was busy, that he needed space, that this was the responsible choice, the mature one. Hours passed. By the time he finally replied, it was brief. "I can't tonight. Hope rehearsal goes well." The response didn't come immediately. Bryan felt the absence like a physical thing. Over the next few days, he kept doing it, creating distance one small decision at a time. He stopped initiating conversations, let messages sit longer than he wanted to. When Ethan shared something personal, Bryan responded kindly but carefully, keeping his words light, neutral, safe. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Inside, everything hurt. Ethan noticed by the third day. It showed in his messages, first shorter, sharper, stripped of their usual warmth. "Did I do something wrong?" Bryan stared at the question for a long time. No, he wanted to say, "You did everything right." Instead, he typed, "No, just busy lately." The lie tasted bitter. The next time they met in person, by coincidence, not design, the distance became impossible to ignore. They crossed paths at the studio late one evening. Bryan had stopped by to return something he'd borrowed, planning to leave quickly. Ethan was in the hallway, jacket half on, hair still damp from a rushed shower. "Oh," Ethan said, surprised. "Hey, hey," Bryan replied. The silence that followed felt wrong, stretched, unfamiliar. Ethan studied him, eyes sharp in a way Bryan hadn't seen before. "You've been quiet." Bryan shrugged. "Just trying to catch up on things." "Right?" Ethan said slowly. There was something tight in his voice. They stood there, neither moving, the hum of the building filling the space between them. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "Did I misread something?" Bryan's throat closed. "No." "Then what is this?" Ethan asked, frustration breaking through. "Because it feels like you're halfway out the door." The words struck closer than Bryan expected. Bryan began, then stopped. He exhaled, steadying himself. "I think we need some space." Ethan blinked. "Space?" "Yes." "Why?" Ethan's voice rose, emotion finally spilling over. "You don't get to just decide that without telling me what I did wrong." Bryan flinched. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Then stop treating me like I did," Ethan snapped. The hallway went quiet. Bryan had never seen Ethan like this. Unguarded, upset, anger edged with hurt. It scared him how much it affected him. "I can't keep doing this," Bryan said quietly. "Doing what?" Ethan demanded. "This?" Bryan gestured helplessly between them. "Being close and not being anything. Pretending it doesn't mean more than it does." Ethan stared at him. "It means something to me." The admission hung heavy in the air. Bryan swallowed. "Then why does it feel like I'm something you'll eventually outgrow?" Ethan's expression faltered. "That's not." "I don't want to be temporary," Bryan said, voice breaking despite his effort to stay calm. "I don't want to be someone you lean on until things get easier, until your life settles, until you decide what you really want." "That's not fair," Ethan said, shaking his head. "You think I haven't been thinking about this? About us?" "Thinking isn't the same as choosing," Bryan replied. Silence fell again, this time heavier. Final. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping in front of Bryan. "You're asking me to risk everything." "I know," Bryan said softly. "And I'm asking myself to risk my heart. I just can't do it halfway." Ethan looked torn, caught between longing and fear, between what he wanted and what his world would allow. "I can't promise you more," Ethan said finally, the words clearly costing him. "Not right now." Bryan nodded, pain blooming sharp and familiar in his chest. "I know." That was the problem. They stood there a moment longer, neither willing to be the first to walk away. Then Bryan stepped back. "I think this is where I go," he said. Ethan didn't stop him. As Bryan turned down the hallway, each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew if he did, he wouldn't leave at all. Behind him, Ethan stood frozen, watching the distance grow. For the first time since they'd met, the silence between them didn't feel safe, felt like an ending. And as Bryan disappeared into the night, both of them were left with the same unbearable thought. This might be goodbye. Chapter 8: The Things We Risk. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his apartment, lights off, city glow bleeding in through the windows. Bryan's words echoed relentlessly in his head. "I don't want to be temporary." Ethan pressed his palms to his eyes, breathing slowly. He had spent years learning how to compartmentalize. Career here, personal life there, emotions carefully rationed. It had worked, mostly, until Bryan. Bryan hadn't asked for anything unreasonable. He hadn't demanded promises or grand gestures. He had simply asked to matter. And Ethan hadn't known how to answer, because the truth terrified him. Wanting Bryan meant risk. Headlines, speculation, contracts scrutinized, fans disappointed. A life he'd built carefully shaken at its foundation. But losing Bryan, that thought hollowed him out. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to imagine the future without that quiet presence. Without messages that felt like home. Without someone who saw him and asked for nothing in return. Felt unbearable. By morning, the fear had crystallized into something sharper. Resolve. Ethan sent the message before he could overthink it. Can we talk? Properly. Please. Bryan didn't reply right away. The waiting was excruciating. When the response finally came, it was brief. Okay. One last time. They met in the same cafe as before, rain misting the windows again as if the city itself remembered. Bryan arrived first this time, sitting rigidly with his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. When Ethan walked in, he didn't hide. No cap, no mask, just Ethan. Bryan looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You're not. I know, Ethan said quietly. I needed to be honest. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down. I was scared, Ethan began. Not of you, of what choosing you would mean. Bryan's jaw tightened. I'm not asking you to give up your life. I know, Ethan said. That's what makes this worse. He leaned forward slightly, eyes earnest. I've spent so long protecting everything I built that I forgot to ask who I was building it for. Bryan didn't respond. He waited. I don't want you to be comfort, Ethan continued, or an escape. I want you because you're you, because you don't disappear when things get hard. Bryan's voice was quiet. I don't want promises. Ethan nodded. I know. I want clarity, Bryan said. I want to know if I'm someone you're willing to choose, even when it's not convenient. Ethan inhaled deeply. I want you, he said. Not in secret. Not halfway. I want you knowing it might cost me things. The words hung between them, raw and terrifying. Bryan searched his face, looking for hesitation. There was fear there, but not doubt. This doesn't mean it'll be easy, Ethan added. Or safe. Bryan let out a shaky breath. I never asked for safe. They sat there, the decision forming quietly between them. Not finalized, not polished, but real. As they stood to leave, the space between them felt different. Charged. Deliberate. A choice had been made. What it would cost, neither of them fully knew yet. But for the first time, they were willing to risk finding out. Chapter 9 Between Us. There was no announcement. No moment where the world seemed to pause. No dramatic confession spoken beneath perfect lighting. What happened between Bryan and Ethan unfolded quietly, the way important things often did. Softly, deliberately, without witnesses. It began with time. Ethan started showing up. Not in grand, sweeping ways, but in the smallest ones that mattered most. Messages sent before Bryan woke up. A quick check-in between rehearsals. Promise kept. Not postponed. Not rescheduled. I have an hour, Ethan said one evening over the phone. It's not much, but it's yours. If you want it. Bryan had closed his eyes at that. Not because of the offer itself, but because of the certainty in Ethan's voice. I want it, Bryan replied, and Ethan stayed, present, focused, not distracted by the noise of his world. That became the shape of them. They met when they could, late nights, early mornings, spaces tucked away from crowds. Sometimes it was just sitting together, legs drawn close on opposite ends of a couch, sharing silence that felt earned instead of empty. They talked too, carefully, honestly. I don't know what this looks like, Ethan admitted one night, voice low. I just know I don't want to keep pretending I don't want you. Bryan had taken a breath before answering. I don't need promises. I just need to know I'm not convenient. Ethan looked at him then, really looked at him. Not like an idol scanning a room. Not like a man weighing consequences. Just Ethan. You're not temporary, he said. You're not something I pass time with. You're. He stopped himself, a quiet laugh escaping. You're someone I choose. The word settled deep in Bryan's chest. Choose. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with certainty about the future. But it was real. They didn't label what they were right away. Didn't rush to define it with words that felt too heavy, too public. Instead, they let it exist in action. Ethan learned to make space. He left rehearsals on time when he said he would. He stopped checking his phone mid-conversation. He listened, not with half his attention, but fully, like nothing else was pulling him away. Bryan learned something too. He learned that being chosen didn't have to hurt, that he didn't have to make himself smaller to fit into someone else's life, that he was allowed to want and be wanted in return. One night, after a long day that had left them both drained, they ended up standing close in Ethan's quiet apartment. The city lights filtered in through the windows, casting soft shadows across the room. Neither of them spoke. Ethan shifted slightly, close enough now that Bryan could feel his warmth, his presence steady and sure. "This is okay, right?" Ethan asked quietly. Bryan nodded. "Yeah, it is." Ethan hesitated, then lifted a hand, stopping just short of Bryan's cheek, as if giving him time to pull away. Bryan didn't. The touch was gentle when it came, careful, reverent. Their first kiss was nothing like the ones Bryan had imagined before. There was no urgency, no hunger rushing ahead of them, just a soft meeting of lips, tentative and warm, as if they were both learning the shape of something precious. Ethan pulled back first, forehead resting against Bryan's. "Okay?" he asked again. Bryan smiled softly. "Yeah, more than okay." They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing in the quiet, the closeness settling into something steady. Love didn't explode into existence. It arrived slowly, in shared mornings, in hands brushing without hesitation, in the way Ethan said Bryan's name like it mattered, in the way Bryan no longer questioned whether he belonged there. Between them, love didn't need to be loud. It was enough that it stayed. Epilogue, a song without an audience. Months later, the world is quieter. Not empty, just softer, like the volume has finally been turned down to something human. Bryan notices it most on evenings like this, when the city outside the apartment hums distantly and the windows are open just enough to let in cool air and muted streetlight. Ethan is barefoot. That alone still feels surreal sometimes. He sits on the couch, sleeves rolled up, hair falling into his eyes without a stylist in sight. No cameras, no staff, no schedule pressing down on his shoulders. Just a guitar resting against his hip, fingers idly strumming as if he's thinking out loud. Bryan sits next to him, legs tucked under him, watching without the sharp ache that used to live in his chest. Listening like he always has, but now he's close enough to hear the tiny sounds between the notes. The brush of skin against strings. Ethan's quiet breath before he starts again. The way the melody shifts when his thoughts wander. The song isn't one Bryan recognizes. It's unfinished, unpolished, soft around the edges. Ethan hums at first, then lets the tune take shape. No lyrics, just sound, gentle and unguarded. The kind of music that isn't meant to impress anyone. The kind that exists because it wants to. Bryan feels warmth spread through him, slow and steady. There was a time when listening to Ethan sing felt like longing, like distance, like wanting something that could never quite be reached. Now it feels like belonging. Ethan stops suddenly, fingers stilling on the strings. "That part doesn't work," he mutters to himself. Bryan smiles. "I liked it." Ethan glances over, eyes soft. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Ethan chuckles quietly and sets the guitar aside, crossing the small space between them without hesitation. He sits beside Bryan, shoulder pressing lightly into his own. Such a simple thing. And it means everything. At first, being together had felt fragile, as if one wrong move might shatter what they'd built. They hadn't announced anything, hadn't defined it publicly. There were no headlines, no confessions wrapped in spotlight and applause, just choices. Ethan choosing to show up when he said he would, choosing to leave earlier sometimes, to say no, to carve out space that was protected, intentional. Bryan choosing to stay even on days when doubt crept in, choosing to believe that consistency was louder than promises. They learned each other slowly, that love didn't have to be loud to be real. Ethan rests his head back against the couch, eyes closed. Bryan watches the tension ease from his face, the same way it always does when the world isn't watching. "Thank you," Ethan says quietly. "For what?" "For listening," he replies. "Even when I'm not performing." Bryan's chest tightens, not painfully this time, but warmly. "That's my favorite kind." Ethan turns his head to look at him. Their faces are close, breath shared, the space between them so small it barely exists at all. There's no rush, no doubt. When Ethan leans in, it's slow, hesitant only out of care. Bryan meets him halfway. The kiss is gentle, unassuming, a soft press of lips that feels like confirmation rather than discovery, like something settling into place exactly where it belongs. When they pull back, Bryan rests his forehead against Ethan's, eyes closed. Outside, a car passes. Somewhere down the street, someone laughs. The world continues, but it no longer feels like it's pulling them apart. Ethan exhales, content. "I used to think I needed an audience for my music to matter." Bryan smiles faintly. And now," Ethan says, brushing his thumb gently over Bryan's knuckles. "I think this is enough." Bryan believes him. He thinks about the first time he ever listened to Ethan sing. Through a screen, alone in his room, dreaming quietly of something impossible. He thinks about the distance that once felt so vast it could never be crossed. Now that distance is gone. Not erased by spectacle or sacrifice, but by presence. Two people sharing a space. A song without an audience. A silence that feels like home. And for the first time, Bryan doesn't feel like he's listening from afar. He's exactly where he's meant to be. It's unfinished, unpolished, soft around the edges. Ethan hums at first, then lets the tune take shape. No lyrics, just sound, gentle and unguarded. The kind of music that isn't meant to impress anyone. The kind that exists because it wants to. Bryan feels warmth spread through him, slow and steady. There was a time when listening to Ethan sing felt like longing, like distance, like wanting something that could never quite be reached. Now it feels like belonging. Ethan stops suddenly, fingers stilling on the strings. "That part doesn't work," he mutters to himself. Bryan smiles. "I liked it." Ethan glances over, eyes soft. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Ethan chuckles quietly and snuggles next to Bryan, shoulder pressing lightly into his own. Such a simple thing. And it means everything. At first, being together had felt fragile, as if one wrong move might shatter what they'd built. They hadn't announced anything, hadn't defined it publicly. There were no headlines, no confessions wrapped in spotlight and applause, just choices. Ethan choosing to show up when he said he would, choosing to leave earlier sometimes, to say no, to carve out space that was protected, intentional. Bryan choosing to stay even on days when doubt crept in, choosing to believe that consistency was louder than promises. They learned each other slowly, that love didn't have to be loud to be real. Ethan rests his head back against the couch, eyes closed. Bryan watches the tension ease from his face, the same way it always does when the world isn't watching. "Thank you," Ethan says quietly. "For what?" "For listening," he replies. "Even when I'm not performing." Bryan's chest tightens, not painfully this time, but warmly. "That's my favorite kind." Ethan turns his head to look at him. Their faces are close, breath shared, the space between them so small it barely exists at all. There's no rush, no doubt. When Ethan leans in, it's slow, hesitant only out of care. Bryan meets him halfway. The kiss is gentle, unassuming, a soft press of lips that feels like confirmation rather than discovery, like something settling into place exactly where it belongs. When they pull back, Bryan rests his forehead against Ethan's, eyes closed. Outside, a car passes. Somewhere down the street, someone laughs. The world continues, but it no longer feels like it's pulling them apart. Ethan exhales, content. "I used to think I needed an audience for my music to matter." Bryan smiles faintly. And now," Ethan says, brushing his thumb gently over Bryan's knuckles. "I think this is enough." Bryan believes him. He thinks about the first time he ever listened to Ethan sing. Through a screen, alone in his room, dreaming quietly of something impossible. He thinks about the distance that once felt so vast it could never be crossed. Now that distance is gone. Not erased by spectacle or sacrifice, but by presence. Two people sharing a space. A song without an audience. A silence that feels like home. And for the first time, Bryan doesn't feel like he's listening from afar. He's exactly where he's meant to be. Thank you for listening Under the Same Moon. I'll be here when you're ready for the next one.